Welcome to yet another episode of Applied Salesforce. Here I shall walk you through a micro project helping you to build an intuitive end-to-end process via a wizard. This involves a screen flow, validations, flow variables, collections, and error logging into a custom object. And finally, navigating the end user to a list view, specifically recently viewed list view. So it's pretty exciting. Without much ado, let's dive in. First, the requirements. Kali, VP of Applications at upquotient.com, a career builder, transformer, and an amplifier company, has entrusted you, an accomplished Salesforce admin, to build the crucial requirements as outlined below. Okay, the first one states that Kali wanted to build an end-to-end process declaratively, offering an intuitive interface for employee users to create their travel approval request, which acts as a parent item along with related expense items, the child records, using a wizard. The wizard exports input forms to accept and create both the parent travel approval and multiple expense items which are child. So travel approval can have multiple expense items. And the below validations have to be implemented again within the wizard. Destination state should be of two uppercase letters only. For instance, TX, TN, JK, etc. Trip start date should be in future. Trip end date cannot precede trip start date, and trip end date should be minimum 14 days from trip start date. The wizard should have provisions to specify whether any more expense items, the child items, are there to input by exposing a flag more expense items. So it essentially means the wizard should have provisions to input more expense items, meaning more than one expense items. Once both travel approval and related expense items are created, the user should be navigated to travel approval list view, specifically recently viewed list view. Okay, so these are 5 different requirements from Kali. And after mulling over the requirements and doing a bit of research, you chalked out the technical design, the solution, how the approach should be. The first one is the end-to-end process can be built using a screen flow, because here we discussed about wizard and input forms. All these things can be easily intuitively built using a screen flow. Then appropriate validations can be implemented as part of the screen components. The screen flow components we could have gives you the provision to build validations within it. Okay, pretty good choice. So once travel approval details are input via screen components, the record can be created and record ID can be saved as flow variable, because you have the wizard exposing a form to input travel approval details, which is the parent you know details. So once that is done, you create the travel approval parent record, and once it is created, you have provisions within the screen flow to uh, input a flow variable with the row ID of the travel approval parent record. Okay, this becomes handy when you move on to the next step of creating the child items. Okay, then once the expense items child details are input, the travel approval parent row ID stored in the flow variable can be mapped to create the association. So the foreign key of your child records have to be populated with the row ID of the parent record, so that you already have it as a flow variable. Then an input screen component of type checkbox can be used to specify whether additional expense items are there to be input. So this comes exports input forms. Okay, you could see this, and this one, right? The wizard should have provisions to specify whether any more expense items are there to input by exposing a flag. So this is pretty important. And all expense items are pushed into a collection variable. Yes, because you it's not a best practice to have the DML, the create DML step to be executed every time an expense item is input, right? So the idea is to have the expense items added to a collection, and once all the expense items are input, then you move on to a step where you execute the create records operation on the collection. So one, if you have five different expense items, you are not going to execute the five different DMLs for create operation, right? So you add all those five different expense items into a collection and have the DML on the collection. So that is the you know the point of bulkification, and it aligns with the best practice. And finally, the list button can be created, right, and placed inside the travel approval list view with the below attributes. Okay, so the display type, behavior, content, source, and the URL, the return URL. So we see that practically how this is implemented, but obviously the button that Kali was has mentioned, right, as part of the requirement, is a list button placed on the travel approval list view. Okay, the parent list view. And yeah, so that button, once the above configuration is complete, the button invokes the flow and helps you to complete the end-to-end process. And once everything is done, once your travel approval and your expense items are all created successfully, then it automatically navigates the user, the employee user, to the travel approval recently viewed list view. Okay, that's how the things can be configured. Okay, and with this, let's move on to this application. Okay, so let's look at the schema. So this is the travel approval, which is a parent entity, and the expense item, a child entity. And in order to log the errors, okay, so I've also created an exception object. Okay, this is an exception object. You could see the object named as exception, and fields, ideally it has the exception message, the exception name, then the record, and the logged in user name. So this is what the exception object, the custom object, is all about. And I wanted to also log the exceptions coming out of the flow into the exception custom object. Okay, so that's another one. And okay, so let's look at the flow. I have detailed the flow in this infographics. So it starts off with, it's a screen flow, and the first step is to create approval, which is the parent record. Let's see, along with the validations, right? So uh, let's look at the validations. So that's the screen flow. You could see this, and the trip start date, trip end date, and the destination state and purpose of trip. So these are the fields that I'm capturing, and this is for your travel approval, which is the parent record, right? So you could see trip start date, and we have certain validations here. The validation message, trip start date should be in future, and the formula we could have, you can insert the resource. Okay, the screen component field, you could see the screen components, and underneath that you could see the trip start date. You can insert the screen component here, the trip start date, and you say just have it should be in future. So that's one of the requirements. You could say that trip start date should be, right, the trip start date should be in future. That's exactly what we have built here. And the next is trip end date. There are multiple validations. Okay, you could see the validate input here, and trip end date should be in future and 14 days from trip start date. Okay, and then trip start date should precede trip end date. So these two validations are built, and it's pretty intuitive. Probably I can show that here. We'll copy it. Pretty simple. Trip end date should be in future, and the trip end date minus the trip start date should be greater than or equal to 14 days. So that exactly what the validations that needs to be implemented as part of the requirement. Okay, and yeah, so this is the screen is done, and next we you know have the create travel approval parent record. So this is the create step. Okay, and in this case, it's a direct input. It's a field from travel approval object, destination state, purpose of trip, trip end date, trip start date. You have all these inputs from the screen component. Okay, and what needs to be noticed here is, you need to have this checkbox checked, manually assign variables, and once the parent component, right? The parent record instance of the parent entity is created. No, it's row ID. Okay, I have this row ID TA as a variable. Okay, this is the flow variable. You could say create. You could say row ID TA. It's a flow variable, which is of type text. Okay, and the parent's row ID gets pushed into the row ID TA. So we have an handle to the parent's row ID. Okay, within the flow. Yes, of course. And then we move on to create additional child items, right? So enter expense item step. This is again a uh, screen component, and this gets auto populated because travel approval, you could say this is the lookup component, and the API name, it's a travel underscore approval, and field API name is travel approval underscore underscore C. So this is essentially the foreign key field, right? This is essentially the foreign key field on the expense item underscore underscore C object. Okay, so field API name travel approval underscore underscore C, and the object is expense item underscore underscore C. So this is your child entity, and we could have a look at this here. Say object manager and expense items, expense item, drill down on it. So expense item underscore underscore C is the object, right? It's the object here. Expense item underscore underscore C, that's a source object. And next would be the fields. You could say the travel approval underscore underscore C, that's the relationship field. Okay, so that goes into, okay, here field API name. So this, and the record ID, the row ID of the parent record, that's a flow variable. Okay, so it automatically populates this thing. Okay, the travel approval would be automatically populated with the parent's parent record. Okay, so that's the one, that's the key thing here, the lookup screen component, the amount field, and the expense item, that's the pick list choice, and the flag more expense items. Okay, so this flag becomes handy to decide whether any more expense items needs to be input or not. Okay, So you could say it's by default it is checked. You could see this global constant true. Okay, so this sums up our two screen components, and then this is pretty crucial. Okay, you could see this, and I have created two flow variables, flow record variables. You could say expense item record. This is a single record variable, and another is expense items record collection. So this is a collection variable of type record. Okay, both are of type record. Here it is collection, can hold multiple instances of the child record. So these are expense items. So this can hold a single instance of expense item, and this can hold multiple instances of expense item, which is child entity. Okay, and you could see that here. Okay, the flow variable, the record single variable is expense item record. Okay, its data type is record and an object is expense item. Allow multiple values is not checked, but for the other one, you could see its data type is record, expense item, object is expense item, allow multiple values, the collection. Okay, so you take, and the assignment, you could see I am assigning the values from the screen component, right? So enter expense items, amount, expense type, and row ID. It's a foreign key that is input into the expense item single record variable. And finally, I am adding the single record variable add. You could see the operator add here, the expense item into the expense item record collection. So both the assignment of expense item data into the expense item single record variable plus adding the expense item single record variable into a collection, both happens within the same step, assignment step. Okay, so that is something, and then there's a decision. You check if the more expense item, the checkbox equals true, which means that you have additional expense items to be created. Then again you get onto the screen component, the expense item screen component, and you follow the process. If is not, then you create the expense item, right? The create the expense item is a single step. You execute the create DML on the collection. Okay, and if there are errors, if there are exceptions that is thrown during the DML, then log this into an exception object. So exception date time, exception message, record name, and username. So you could log these values, current date time, fault message. Here I'm logging it as null, and use the logged in username. Okay, so this sums up our the flow, which does all of the heavy lifting. And then let's switch our focus to the navigation, so how the button is built. And you know so we navigate to the travel approval request, the travel approval entity, and you could see the list. Okay, so yeah, so button links and actions. Click on that. I've created a button. You could see I'll edit this. Okay, okay. So important things to note is the display type. The display type has to be list button. Okay, you could say list button, and if you look at an example, it shows where this uh, shows up. Okay, and then the behavior display in existing window with sidebar, content sources URL, and the important thing is the return URL, right? So the first part is your flow, the flow link. You could see until this flow e2e bulkified. So you can navigate to the flow. Okay, navigate to the flow, and you could see this one, the URL, the flow URL. Okay, flow e2e ta bulkified. That's exactly what you put here, and then a question mark, and return URL is the standard, which specifies once the flow successfully completes where to navigate. And now you take this particular part from your travel approval. Let's say I navigate to this travel approval. You could say click navigate to travel approval, and I am interested in the recently viewed list view. Okay, and from the top, right after your domain, so this is your domain. Right after the domain, you need to copy this URL, including the right slash. Okay, copy this and paste this as the return URL. Okay, so this particular part. Okay, and once this is done, you can navigate to, yeah, so once this is done, you can yeah, so you can navigate to list view button layout and add that list view button, the list view button that just created, into the custom buttons. I will navigate to the application, travel app, travel approvals. Okay, so once you add it here, okay, so the idea is once you add this button into this layout, object manager, travel approval, okay, list view button layout, right? So this is the key. Okay, so once you add that here, you find that available as part of the list view. Okay, so now let's look at how the whole of these shows up in the UI, and whether it conforms to what is requested by Kali. Okay, so I have that here, and click on create TA and expense items. That's the list button that I just created. Okay, automatically it adds 7 days to the travel trip start date, and you can modify it. Let's say the trip start date is 16, so I'm trying to invoke the validation here, and trip end date probably 25. Again, the validation kicks in because we need to have, the first is about the future date. The start date has to be in future, and second is the trip end date should be 14 days from the trip start date, and the destination state, I'd say, um, okay, and the purpose, okay, meeting the fantastic Gen Z pros at Chennai. Okay, so this should trigger many validations. There are almost all the validations we are breaking, because destination state should be of 2 characters. So I'll show you how that is built, because I presume that we did not discuss um, the destination state. So that's a pattern. You could see the validate input. I've given the validation message. Okay, and this is the pattern, regex of destination state. Okay, so A to Z, it says no, A to Z is only acceptable the range, and it can only be of 2 characters. Okay, and this specifies the end. Okay, this is how we built, and let's see the output. Okay, click on enter expense items. You could see scores of validations. The trip start date should be in future. Okay, and the trip end date, again, you say one of the conditions are not met. Here typically it's a 14-day condition, right? It's not met. and the destination, only two uppercase letters are allowed. So we'll correct one after the other. So I'll put the trip start date to be in future. Okay, and then you click next. So this succeed and this still fails, and 14 days, maybe I can have it as 10th May 15th, let's say, and then click on next. That goes through, and the destination state, it has to be to a letter uppercase. I'll put TN. Okay, now it goes through, and this is the child items I need to create, right? So let's say 12,000 for my airfare and more items. Yes, I have more items to create, and this is 40 or 58,000 for my hotel expense. Yes, I have more items, and the expense meals could be again 12,000. Okay, and I don't have any more. Okay, click on next, and it has to take me to the recently viewed. Okay, so I can also have uh, TA created today. You could see some things that you did it today just through the flow, and the related list, the three expense items, airfare, hotel, and meals, all fine. So this typically means that the entire, the requirement into end requirement, including multiple perspectives that Kali asked, is successfully accomplished, and it is demoed successfully. Everyone is happy. Okay, so that's the end of this episode. Thanks for watching. Take care and bye bye.